Jim Croce was a beloved singer-songwriter whose heartfelt and relatable songs captured the spirit of America in the early 1970s. Known for hits like Bad Bad Leroy Brown and Time in a Bottle, Croce's music was a blend of folk, rock, and pop that resonated with audiences across the country. However, just as his career was reaching new heights, Croce's life was tragically cut short in a plane crash on September 20th, 1973, at the age of 30. This documentary explores the life, career, and untimely death of Jim Croce, as well as the legacy he left behind. Jim Croce was born on January 10th, 1943 in South Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to Italian-American parents. Growing up in a working-class family, Croce's love for music developed early, influenced by the folk and pop music of the 1950s and 1960s. He taught himself to play the guitar and began performing at local parties, school events, and coffee houses. After high school, Croce attended Villanova University, where he continued to perform and refine his craft. He met his future wife, Ingrid Jacobson, during this time, and together they began playing music as a duo. They released their first album, Jim and Ingrid Croce, in 1969, but the record received little attention. The couple struggled financially, working odd jobs to make ends meet. Despite these challenges, Jim continued writing songs and performing whenever he could. Croce's big break came in the early 1970s when he signed with ABC Records and released his debut solo album, You Don't Mess Around with Jim, in 1972. The album was a commercial success, featuring hits like Operator, That's Not the Way It Feels, and the title track, You Don't Mess Around with Jim. Croce's honest lyrics and warm, conversational singing style struck a chord with audiences. He quickly became known for his storytelling ability, capturing the everyday struggles and emotions of ordinary people. In the early days of the 1970s, Jim Croce lived at 3 High Spire Road in Downingtown, Pennsylvania, as it provided a peaceful and secluded environment that was conducive to his songwriting and family life. He and his wife rented an apartment in the farmhouse, situated on a large piece of land. The Downingtown property was a sanctuary for Jim and his wife, representing a balance between his career and his commitment to family and personal tranquility. Before moving on, let's take a few moments to showcase what a great lyricist Jim was. Do you know his song Operator? Check out the images he paints. The narrator is speaking to a telephone operator, asking for assistance in making a call. This request sets the scene, suggesting he's reaching out for something important. The number he's trying to call is on an old matchbook, a symbol of the past. The fading ink reflects the passage of time, and perhaps the fading of the relationship he's trying to revisit. He reveals that his ex-girlfriend is now living with his former best friend Ray. This line introduces the theme of betrayal. Not only has he lost his lover, but also his friend. This adds a touch of irony. His ex-lover had previously expressed negative feelings about Ray, yet she's now with him. This twist highlights the unpredictability of relationships. He acknowledges the cliché that people often say about life's disappointments. Quote, "That's just the way it goes," end quote. But he's trying to brush off the pain and move on, even though it's difficult. He asks the operator for the number to call his ex, claiming he just wants to tell them he's doing well. This is a facade. He's pretending to be okay when he's really struggling inside. He tries to convince himself that he's handling the heartbreak maturely. This line reflects denial and the inner conflict between what he wants to feel and what he actually feels. He wishes he could truly believe the words he's saying, but deep down, he knows he's still hurting. The repeated phrase, quote, "That's not the way it feels," end quote, emphasizes the gap between his words and his true emotions. Yeah, they just don't write songs like that anymore. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that as of the time that you're listening to this, the singer-songwriters and storytellers don't exist anymore like they did in the 60s and 70s? Kindly let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now let's continue talking about Jim's career. Following the success of his first album, Jim released Life and Times in 1973, which included the chart-topping single Bad Bad Leroy Brown. The song, with its catchy melody and colorful character portrait, became an instant hit and was nominated for 2 Grammy Awards. Jim's relatable lyrics and engaging storytelling had made him a household name, and he was poised for even greater success. During this period, Jim's career was booming. He was constantly on tour, performing sold-out shows across the United States. Despite his fame, Jim remained grounded, often expressing how much he missed spending time with his wife Ingrid and their young son AJ. He was planning to take a break from touring to focus on his family and pursue new creative projects. In 1973, Jim and Ingrid and their child lived in the Point Loma area of San Diego, California. They were drawn to the laid-back seaside lifestyle, which provided a peaceful setting for Jim to write music and spend time with his family away from the pressures of the music industry. Their home in Point Loma became a refuge where Jim could focus on his songwriting and enjoy a quieter life with Ingrid and their son. When he was not on tour, the area's scenic beauty and relaxed atmosphere reflected Jim's desire to balance his growing fame with a more grounded, family-oriented lifestyle. Now let's jump to the fateful day. On September 20th, 1973, Jim Croce and guitarist Maury Mullison, who was 24 years old, arrived by private plane in Natchitoches, Louisiana. Maury Mullison, who was a talented guitarist and Jim's musical collaborator, provided the distinctive guitar accompaniments in Jim's songs. Jim and Maury and the others on the plane were picked up and driven to town. Before reaching their location, Jim asked to be driven to the post office. He had written a letter to his wife, and he wanted to mail it to her right away. She would receive that letter about a week later. In the letter, Jim expressed his longing to reconnect with his wife and son. He mentioned the possibility of quitting the music business altogether and becoming a, quote, public hermit, end quote, focusing on writing movie scripts and short stories that would keep him closer to home. Among other things, he wrote, quote, remember, it's the first 60 years that count, and I've got 30 to go, end quote. After lunch and spending some time relaxing at their motel rooms, Jim, Maury, manager Kenneth Cortez, who was 28 years old, who handled logistics for Croce's tours, comedian George Stevens, who was 36, and who was opening for Jim on the tour, and Jim's road manager, Dennis Rast, who was 30, headed over to Northwestern State University for sound checks and preparation. Later that evening, the concert at Northwestern State University began. Jim delivered a lively performance filled with his signature blend of humor, storytelling, and heartfelt songs. The audience was captivated. Typically, a couple thousand people would be there, but that night, the audience was half full, not because of Jim, but because of the historic Battle of the Sexes tennis match between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs, which was televised that night and drew 90 million viewers. So it was kind of a bad night to have a concert for anyone. Later, after the concert ended, Jim stayed on the stage to talk to a few people and sign autographs. He then checked his watch. You see, originally the group had planned to spend the night in Natchitoches, but Jim decided to call the pilot, who was staying at the nearby Lakeview Motel, to arrange an early departure that night. Jim was eager to get out of there and get on a plane to fly to the next town where he would be performing. You see, he and Maury were set to play another concert at the small Austin College in Sherman, Texas the next day. The pilot, Robert N. Elliott, who was 57 years old, was not expecting to leave his hotel room that night when he got the call that Jim wanted to leave immediately instead of the next day. Mr. Elliott was frantic. He tried to call a taxi, but there were no taxis in Natchitoches at the time. So he quickly left his room and began to briskly walk and sometimes run towards the airport, which was roughly 3 miles away. He struggled to navigate the poorly lit rural roads around the area and got lost at one point while crossing a cornfield. This just added to his stress, and this made him anxious and out of breath. He was feeling the effects of his severe coronary artery disease, which left him easily fatigued. Thankfully, at one point, a police officer saw him and drove him the rest of the way. and so Mr. Elliott finally arrived at the airport. Witnesses reported that he looked disheveled and exhausted. Some people said he looked like he had been hit by a truck, rattled, hot, and sweaty. Jim Croce, Maury Mulison, George Stevens, Kenneth Cortez, Dennis Rast, and pilot Robert Elliott boarded the Beechcraft E-18S twin-engine plane. Jim was seated in the front, next to the pilot. The cramped interior of the aircraft, typical for such small planes, meant everyone was sitting close together, each absorbed in conversations and their thoughts as they prepared for another flight. Meanwhile, Mr. Elliott was visibly stressed, and his breathing was labored from his earlier exertion. He was an experienced pilot, but unfamiliar with the airport's conditions. He struggled to prepare the Beechcraft E-18S twin-engine plane for the flight. The passengers were so busy talking amongst themselves that they did not notice that Mr. Elliott was disoriented. His fatigue was not apparent to those around him. No one realized the full extent of the pilot's physical distress. If they had, perhaps someone would have stopped him from piloting the plane. Mr. Elliott ran through his pre-flight checks, but was not as thorough as he should have been due to time pressure and his physical state. He was, of course, aware of his coronary artery disease, which significantly affected his stamina, but yet he continued with his duties, determined to complete the flight to Sherman, Texas. Just after 10:40, the plane taxied down the runway. Jim and the others were talking about the concert and making plans for the next show. Mr. Elliott tried to concentrate, but the physical toll of his health condition, compounded by the hurried takeoff, was showing. Unfortunately, no one noticed. Elliott continued the takeoff procedure. As the plane began taxiing down the runway, the familiar vibrations of the engine filled the cabin. The noise was loud and constant, the kind that rattles your bones, accompanied by the slight shaking of the small aircraft. Mr. Elliott pushed the throttle forward, and the plane accelerated down the dark runway. The lights of the airport were dim, and outside it was pitch black, with only the faint glow of the plane's navigation lights to guide them. Inside, the group felt a rush of speed that also sensed that the plane was struggling. The takeoff was not smooth. There was a noticeable lack of lift. Despite the acceleration, the aircraft only managed to lift a few feet off the ground, fighting to gain altitude, but never climbing more than about 30 feet. As the plane climbed to reach above the tree line, the pilot, struggling with the dark and his own physical condition, couldn't properly see or navigate. At this point, the pilot experienced a black hole illusion, which occurs when a pilot takes off or lands at night in conditions with little to no visible external references, such as lights or landmarks. It is common when flying over water, dark terrain, or when the runway is surrounded by complete darkness, making it appear as a black hole. In these moments, the cabin was filled with the roar of the engines, but the passengers would have noticed something was wrong. There was no sudden upward jolt that signifies a safe climb. Instead, there was the unsettling feeling of the plane barely lifting off, hovering too close to the ground. Seconds later, the right wing clipped a large pecan tree at the end of the runway. The impact was abrupt and violent. The collision jolted everyone inside, throwing them to the side and causing immediate chaos. There was a deafening crash as the wing tore apart, and the plane began to lose control, spinning slightly as it veered off its intended path. The impact with the tree destabilized the aircraft, causing it to quickly lose what little altitude it had. The plane descended rapidly. There was no time to correct or level out. It took only a second or two for the plane to hit the ground. And when the plane struck the ground, the crash was catastrophic. The aircraft hit at a sharp angle, crumbling on impact. The force of the collision was severe enough to instantly kill all 6 people on board. The violent stop was instantaneous, with the front of the plane absorbing most of the impact force. The engine, which was still running during the tree collision, was abruptly stopped upon impact with the ground. In the split second following the ground impact, the entire structure of the plane was compromised, crushing the fuselage, breaking apart wings, and rupturing fuel lines. The engine noise was replaced by the sounds of tearing metal, breaking glass, and the abrupt heavy thud of the plane settling. Thankfully, the passengers did not have time to react or even comprehend what was happening. Due to the sudden and severe nature of the crash, death was instantaneous upon impact with the ground, caused by blunt force trauma. None of the passengers experienced prolonged pain or awareness of the crash's aftermath. Survival would have been impossible. The tragic sequence unfolded so rapidly that those inside would not have had a chance to scream, brace, or even realize the full extent of the danger they were in. The horrifyingly fast sequence of events marked the end of Jim Croce's life and the lives of his companions, turning what should have been a routine flight into an unforgettable tragedy. Emergency services soon arrived on the scene, but there was nothing they could do. The plane wreckage was strewn apart the impact zone. A piece of the airplane was lodged in the pantry that the plane struck during takeoff. The scene was unlike anything anyone present had ever seen before. The wreckage of the plane resembled the aftermath of a bomb explosion. The debris field vividly illustrated the crash's violent impact, highlighting the sheer force of the collision. The shattered remains of the plane lay scattered around the crash site, a devastating testament to the destruction. It took quite a while, but eventually the bodies of the passengers were recovered from the crash site, and the grim task of identifying the victims began. Once again, the passengers were Jim Croce, singer, songwriter, and performer; Maury Mulison, Jim's lead guitarist, friend, and musical collaborator; George Stevens, the comedian who was the opening act for Jim and Maury; Dennis Rast, Jim's road manager; Kenneth Cortez, who was the tour manager; and the sixth victim was Robert N. Elliott, the pilot of the chartered plane. News of the crash started to spread before midnight. Those who were at the concert earlier in the evening were stunned by the news. The death of Jim Croce, who had just performed a lively and heartfelt show hours before, felt surreal and incomprehensible. The next morning, Jim Croce's death sent shockwaves through the music world, leaving fans and fellow musicians mourning the loss of a gifted storyteller whose songs captured the essence of the human experience. Jim's wife Ingrid received the heartbreaking news from a relative who was surprised that no one had yet told her of the plane crash and Jim's death, and so all alone she was left to process the loss of her husband and the father of their son. Fans around the world mourn the sudden and tragic loss of a rising star whose potential was never fully realized. In the wake of the crash, the National Transportation Safety Board launched an investigation to uncover the cause of the accident. The results were both heartbreaking and avoidable. The primary cause was pilot error. The investigation revealed that the pilot failed to properly assess the takeoff path, and his decision to depart in darkness proved to be a fatal misjudgment. His fatigue and health issues may have clouded his judgment during the takeoff, causing him to misjudge the runway length and obstacles in his path. His physical limitations, combined with the dark, poorly lit conditions of the rural airport, set the stage for the tragic accident. Additionally, the pilot was suffering from severe coronary artery disease, which may have impaired his abilities during the flight. In fact, there is some speculation that Mr. Elliott may have even had a heart attack during takeoff. And if that's the case, it is possible that all the passengers knew that they were in peril. Although the plane was found to be mechanically sound, the pilot's oversight of obstacles at the end of the runway critically compromised its safe takeoff. Following the crash, coroner Charles Cook was quoted in news stories saying that some drugs were found at the scene, but tests confirmed that the 57-year-old pilot was clean. There were no drugs in his system. The findings of the NTSB left Jim's family, friends, and fans struggling with the senseless nature of the tragedy. Knowing how unavoidable all of this was, and it was an absolute disgrace that the pilot's errors claimed the life of a beloved musician at the height of his career. The day after the crash, Jim Croce's single, I Got a Name, was released as scheduled and climbed the charts, eventually becoming a top 10 hit. Later that year, Time in a Bottle was re-released, and by the end of 1973, it had reached the #1 spot, making it a haunting testament to Jim Croce's lasting impact even in the wake of such tragedy. Jim Croce's death was a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictable nature of fate. His wife Ingrid was left to navigate the challenges of raising their son without the man she had loved and partnered with creatively. Over the years, Ingrid worked tirelessly to preserve Jim's legacy, sharing stories, memories, and the music that he left behind. Jim's son, AJ, was just 2 years old at the time of his father's death. As he grew up, AJ pursued his own career in music, often reflecting on the influence of his father's work on his own artistic journey. Though he has carved out a distinct identity as a musician, AJ has often acknowledged the emotional weight of carrying on his father's legacy. Despite his short career, Jim Croce's music has continued to resonate with new generations of listeners. His songs, often marked by their storytelling and emotional sincerity, have been covered by countless artists and have been featured in films, TV shows, and commercials. Jim's ability to capture the joys and sorrows of everyday life has ensured that his music remains timeless. The tragic death of Jim Croce in 1973 was a profound loss to the music world, cutting short a career that had just begun to flourish. His songs, however, have lived on, providing comfort, joy, and reflection to millions of listeners. Jim Croce's legacy is one of authenticity and connection, a reminder of the power of music to tell stories that resonate deeply with the human spirit. It has been said that people die twice. The first is when they pass away. The second time is when nobody speaks their name anymore. That won't happen to Jim Croce. His name and legacy live on through his music, ensuring that while his life was cut short, his name and music will always be known. So, what do you think of Jim Croce's life, songs, and untimely death? Were you alive when it happened? What did you think when you found out? Are you a fan of his music? If so, what are your favorite songs of his? Also, how much do you know about Maury Muleson? He was on his way to becoming a big star in his own right. He was a great singer and songwriter known for his intricate guitar work, emotive voice, and reflective songwriting. Before teaming up with Jim Croce, Muleson released his own solo album, Gingerbread, which showcased his talent for crafting deeply personal and poetic lyrics paired with sophisticated melodies. His voice was gentle yet expressive, adding a layer of warmth and sincerity to his performances. When you get a chance, check out some of his music, and please share your thoughts about all of this in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more shows like this. You can support my work through the links below, and you can visit campfireshop.com for candles, teas, herbal supplements, and more. Kindly join my channel and Patreon for exclusive walk-in tours and photos, and leave a super thanks in the comments below. Please be kind to all living things and adopt some cats and dogs from your local shelter. They'll be grateful, and so will you. Until next time, I wish you safe travels on all your journeys.